The morning the audit team arrived, the city wore a shawl of rain that draped itself over glass and metal, as if the skyline had decided to breathe slower. My office window fogged with the humidity of my coffee, and the swirl of steam lit by the desk lamp looked like something alive. The printer chattered in a far corner, stubborn as a small dog left to guard the door. I stood in heels I had picked for their noise, for the way their punctuation announced my presence on hallways that preferred I pass unnoticed. The week ahead would demand something theatrical, I told myself. Resolve, polish, the smile that never reached my eyes. My calendar glowed with back-to-back meetings, red bars pressing against one another like bruises. Outside the glass, umbrellas flocked toward the revolving doors. I thought of the promises I had made to no one in particular, to rest more, breathe deeper, reclaim my weekends. Then I opened the email with the subject line, Audit, Final Schedule. I took a sip. I let the coffee scald the hesitation right off my tongue. By 10, the floor hummed. Storm coats hung like tired soldiers along the coat rack behind the receptionist's desk. Every corridor smelled faintly of office perfume, printer heat, and wet wool. The CFO was late, but his stand-in arrived. Our new senior VP of strategy, the one with the reputation for straightening what bent, a fixer from the parent company. He was earlier than everyone else and yet somehow carried himself as if time adjusted to him. I had seen his picture in the internal memo, a headshot in grayscale. In person he was all color and restraint. A navy tie, a silver watch, a gaze that absorbed detail without flinching. He introduced himself in a voice that reminded me of dark wood and late jazz. He used my full name. He had read my reports. He said we would get through the week if we treated every pressure point as a question rather than a verdict. I nodded, already aware of the little stir his presence caused in the cube farm beyond the glass. From the periphery came the rumors with their soft shoes. He had been widowed. He had never married. He kept a ranch somewhere that didn't fit a suit. He collected first editions. He ate dinner at his desk. He preferred to stand in meetings because it forced clarity. Rumors breed in offices like ivy, clinging to truth when available, to brick when not. We met on neutral ground, the conference room with glass walls that collected reflections like a pond collects leaves. The audit team unrolled their spreadsheets and distributed their questions with an almost tender thoroughness. I sat at the end with my notes already tabbed, the budget variance flagged in soft yellow like a caution light that would not turn off. He sat opposite the lead auditor and asked concise questions that made no one defensive. He leaned on the table with forearms like brackets around the room's anxiety, urging it to stay still. My job that day was not to be brilliant. It was to be steady. Divisions like ours were held together by people like me, people who remembered who had promised what to whom, who could locate a receipt by scent alone, who had taught themselves to remain both visible and unremarkable in the months after a divorce that tasted of silence. I had signed those papers in winter. Now it was late spring and the rain came warm, as if the world had decided to steam clean itself. He and I exchanged something that was not quite conversation and not quite strategy. It existed in the subtle current of committee work, the glance that says I will take this question. The pen left precisely where the other can reach it. The nod that acknowledges an unvoiced concern. The chemistry of collaboration has no scent, and yet it fills the lungs. By afternoon the storm lifted, leaving light pooled on the carpet in gold squares. He paused by my door after the auditors dispersed for the day. We debriefed standing, as if chairs would slow us down. He said my breakdown of vendor payments had moments of elegance. No one had ever used that word for my spreadsheets. He used it without irony. I explained the troublesome line items, the ones that skated too close to policy, but not over it. He listened with the careful attention you reserve for a story you sense can break a heart if mishandled. In the days that followed, respect turned to fascination the way a hallway draft becomes a wind if the right door opens. He had a way of making decisions that included the quiet person in the corner, the one whose name other people forgot. He asked for clarity. He rewarded it with trust. He never made me feel like a messenger. He made me a partner. I did not realize how starved I was for that particular kind of nourishment. Gossip adjusted to new facts. He had a daughter in grad school. He did not correct anyone's pronunciation of her name, though almost all of us got the emphasis wrong. He ran early in the morning. He stayed late but left without fanfare. In meetings, he wore restraint like a well-cut overcoat, nothing flamboyant, everything intentional. When he looked at me rarely, and never when others were watching, it felt like standing near a quiet fireplace. You could ignore it if you tried. I did not try. Our project grew under the kind of pressure that makes glass sing. The parent company wanted a leaner quarter. Board members wanted proof of solvency and bow tying. Meanwhile, a mid-level manager in procurement had learned the ancient art of empire building through layered approvals and opacity. In other words, the perfect recipe for suspicion. The auditors were not unkind, but their questions walked with the cold poise of winter, and sometimes they knocked. I came in earlier and left later, not out of instruction, but because momentum carries. One night after most of the floor had emptied, the cleaner's cart rolled by like a quiet parade, and the skyline pressed its neon cheek against the glass. He appeared in my doorway with a stack of vendor contracts and a tilt of apology. He hated interruptions, he said without saying. We worked at my round guest table, rather than the conference room, sharing the circle like people who had made peace with geometry. The hum of the elevator shaft threaded through our conversation. Somewhere distantly, the building's late-night jazz station played something brushed and tender. I told him about the divorce without telling him the worst of it. Two people gradually preserving themselves by erasing their marriage, the kind of clean end some friends called civilized, and others, my mother, considered cowardly. He told me about the house he kept somewhere inland, a place with trees that outlived opinions. He said he cooked on Sundays because it slowed time. He spoke of his daughter's research in a tone that resembled prayer. I spoke of my father's calendar stuffed with paper scraps because he refused to trust apps, because handwriting held him accountable and screens made him glide. We did not share much more than that. Our words were chosen like gifts. The closeness was a series of resistances, a choreography of not yets. His hand near mine on the table, but not on it. My pulse steadying in the pauses. The scent of his cologne. Something clean that never arrived before him and never stayed behind. We became archivists of the space between us, its laws, its protections. If neither of us moved, we both would. Neither of us moved. The crisis came in the 6th day of the audit, when the rain returned and the atrium's palms dripped like they were trying to speak. A rumor broke. A leak from procurement had reached a trade journalist who sharpened ambiguity for sport. The article arrived on our screens with the kind of headline designed to thin your breath and heat your ears. It implied impropriety without explicitly naming it. It used adverbs that made ordinary actions seem sultry with deceit. It ran our company's name beneath a watermark of caution. HR's face tightened. Legal wore expressions like architectural drawings with all the warmth moved offstage. The CFO directed his worry in a narrow beam at our floor. He was a man who disliked drama only because he was not its author. The senior VP, my senior VP, did not join Panic's rehearsal. He read the article once, closed his laptop like a benediction, and looked at me. His eyes said we will not let a paragraph rewrite our truth. His voice said we would meet with Audit and then with HR, that we would separate heat from light, that this was where we earned our salaries with clean-spined honesty. We did not speak of ourselves. Ourselves had become the tender understory, alive but unwilling to risk sunlight. We dealt in memos and timelines, calendar trails and policy citations. He asked me for a chronology of approvals in procurement over 18 months. He wanted a map of the hands that had touched the contracts we now examined. I gave him the map and the legend. He looked at me in the moment just before gratitude becomes speech. He said nothing. I felt the heat of being seen. By the time the audit reconvened, the rumor had resewn itself like dandelion floss. The elevator held clusters of whispers. The kitchen overflowed with too clean jokes about transparency. Word had it that the auditors would ask their questions as if cross-examining. I wore a navy dress with a high neckline, not because anyone would mistake me for the problem, but because armor can be polite. Before the meeting, he passed me in the hall, angled as if both of us were busy. He did not touch me. He did not slow. But his shoulder nearly brushed mine, and the electricity of almost contact ran the length of me like a whispered name. In the room, the glass walls mirrored everyone at once. The lead auditor was courteous. Her team's questions were precise. They had traced a series of approvals that looked, from a distance, like policy compliance but felt, up close, like choreography designed to confuse. She asked for context I had already compiled in neat stacks. He prompted me with just enough to ensure I could finish the shape of each answer on my own. Where the CFO would have interjected, he waited. Where HR might have speculated, he reminded us of the facts. I spoke about timeline and variance. I explained that a vendor's sudden discount rate had triggered an exception process, and that a manager had opted to detour through a lesser-known policy to speed delivery. It was not illegal, it was unwise. The auditor pressed. I pressed back with documentation, an email chain whose full context clarified what the headline had tried to insinuate. The air felt sharp as a just-peeled apple. He let me finish. A small nod from him punctuated the last sentence, a period placed without noise. When it ended, there were no applause lines. The auditors asked to review 2 more items. HR scheduled a follow-up. The CFO left with the distracted gait of a man who had remembered another problem and fallen in love with it. I gathered my papers. He remained still. I could sense the conference room's glass noticing us, as if to say that the room had one job, and it was to display. Later, at my office door, a delivery. White lilies and irises in a clear glass vase. Rain still clinging in beads to the petals as if they had been harvested from the storm. There was a card tucked discreetly between stems, the kind of card that tries to be formal and fails at the corner where ink softens. I was alone. The floor was temporarily emptied by a fire drill that no one took seriously and thus had abandoned early. I slid the card free with careful fingers. For what we can't admit. I held the words as if they had heat. I read them again, and the room shifted its weight around me. The hum of the building's heart seemed louder. The flower's scent rose like memory. It was an apology, I thought, and then decided it wasn't. An apology would hide. This was a confession in a language designed for plausible deniability, and yet it felt like a hand pressed to my sternum, the warm center of someone else's restraint asking to meet mine. I did the only thing that made sense. I moved the vase to a table near the window where the light could hold it, and I locked the door. It was not the act of a lover. It was the act of a custodian preserving evidence of something sacred. I stood there listening as the hallway slowly reprised its usual noise. I heard laughter, the patterned return of keyboards. When I opened the door, I was ordinary again. He did not appear that afternoon. He was with HR, then with Audit, then with the CEO. I received emails like beads on a string. Polite, official, useful. I responded with the same. Behind each sentence lay 1,000 things unspoken. I did not write "thank you for the flowers." I did not reference the card. The college daughter's name, her precise, beautiful cadence, echoed unbidden when I washed my hands, when I rode the elevator. I thought of his Sunday meals. I thought of my father's scraps of paper. I thought about the percentage of work that is actually about the work, and the larger percentage that is about stewarding ourselves through the work. Gossip sniffed the bouquet almost immediately. A few colleagues drifted in with casual pretexts, their eyes drawn by the vase behind me. I did not volunteer an origin story. I said a client had sent them. It wasn't untrue. Our work had served clients, and some days the building itself felt like one. I saw a few people look for a card and then pretend they weren't. One assistant, the sweetest of the lot, told me lilies meant devotion. I told her they also meant clarity. We smiled like people on opposite shores signaling across fog. That evening, he found me in the hallway between the elevators and the vending machines, a cul-de-sac of carpet where the lights are always one notch dimmer. He stopped and, still at a respectful distance, asked after the final deliverable for the board. His voice held none of what the card confessed, but his mouth tightened at the corner the way it had in the meeting just before I spoke. I told him the brief would be ready. We discussed font sizes with the seriousness of surgeons. I named the sections we might cut to preserve attention without losing integrity. He listened to each suggestion as if he had been waiting for an excuse to respect me more. He looked like a man who expected to be accused of something he hadn't done. I wondered if the flowers frightened him. I wondered if the handwriting had felt like a decision at a crossroads. To stay, to step forward, to walk back. He did not reference them. I did not either. Instead, he asked if I was all right, then lower, so it didn't reach the elevator's ear. He said he admired the way I had handled the auditor's questions, that I had placed facts with a kind of elegance that could not be ignored. I said the week had outlasted my best shoes, and he laughed, short, surprised, as if I had given him permission to be human. Then there was the business trip, the one no one wanted, but everyone agreed was necessary. An off-site with the parent company's audit group to walk through process changes. We took an evening flight washed in metallic twilight, the kind that turns everyone into silhouettes of themselves. I had packed light. He carried a garment bag that made him look more like a musician than an executive. We did not sit together, and I was grateful. The plane's engine noise made it easier to breathe around the pressure that proximity invited. The hotel lobby was marble and echo, a place designed for impressions rather than comfort. The elevators smelled faintly of citrus, as if cleanliness had a parent. When our doors closed on adjacent floors, it felt like a compromise struck without witnesses. That night, I worked on slides until the clock wrestled me into bed. I wondered if he cooked on Sundays in these sterile kitchens with their apologetic kettles. I wondered if he slept on his side facing the alarm clock or the window. It was not desire so much as curiosity braided with caution, an instinct to know the perimeter of the thing that moved inside me. The next day, in a fluorescent conference room, a manager from the parent company recited procedure as if reading scripture. There are few things more dangerous than a zealot with a policy binder. He asked questions he did not want answered, only echoed back to him in the key he preferred. My senior VP, my almost that would never be, chose respect again. He acknowledged the man's concerns, then offered an incremental path rather than a fire sale of truth. He deferred to me at one point, and I felt the gaze of the room pass over like a weather front. I spoke of risk in a register that would not spook anyone, like a horse trainer soothing a skittish gelding. At lunch, he and I found a corner of the lobby to stand and sip something that called itself soup in a paper cup. He said he disliked New York in this kind of weather. Too much brilliance made brittle. I said I found comfort in grid systems. They made getting lost a choice. He hummed assent. He asked after my father. I asked after his daughter's research. We smiled at the proof that we were storing details about each other the way you store a favorite scarf in a drawer that smells like lavender. Later, in the elevator going up, it jolted to a pause between floors, a hiccup in the building's throat. We were alone. Silence has a weight, and that weight is merciful when two people have been lifting too much. I felt my own breath change. The citrus scent of the elevator felt like a joke. The truth between us tasted like espresso without the sugar. We stood several feet apart. He closed his eyes briefly, and I watched the way he returned to himself on the exhale. The car resumed like nothing had happened. When the doors opened, he gestured for me to exit first. His hand hovered near the small of my back without touching. The electricity of it lit me for hours. The crisis deepened when a second article appeared, this time with a photo of our building filtered to look ominous, as if the windows were teeth. The story was thin but pointed. A board member panicked precisely as the journalist hoped he would. HR scheduled a disciplinary review of the procurement manager who had constructed the policy detour. Some colleagues began to look at me as if proximity to the facts was the same as complicity with them. A coworker I had mentored stopped meeting my eye at the coffee machine. The kindness of strangers is nothing compared to the kindness of those you once trained. In the meeting where the board member tried to direct an outcome he hadn't earned with facts, my senior VP made a choice that changed the air. He said we would accept responsibility for oversight, not guilt, but consequence. He said our process allowed ambiguity to become a habit, not a one-off. He included himself in the we. Then he said, softly, as if introducing a tune everyone knew but had forgotten, my name. He credited me with surfacing the detour early, with refusing to let convenience disguise itself as compliance. He used the word integrity as if it belonged in the room. It was a confession of a different sort, not of love, not of desire, but of where trust should land. It cost him social capital he could have saved for a day when applause might be easier to come by. It redirected heat away from me without placing it on anyone else. In so doing, he did not save the procurement manager or the manager's choices. He simply refused to let our floor become a place where blame bought relief. The board member quieted. HR's tone softened into something more like medicine than trial. Afterward, he and I crossed paths in the corridor lined with the old architectural photographs of our headquarters from before the renovation, sepia deeds to a time when glass had not yet learned to pretend to be air. He asked me, again without asking, if I could join him to review the finalized control changes. We worked in his office this time. His door stayed open a few inches because doors in offices only mean what we allow them to mean, and I saw no merit in gossip winning a prize. He pulled a blanket from the back of his chair and looped it over the arm as if confessing to needing comfort. He was paler than usual, the exhaustion of someone who'd been stared at all day by people who wanted something you couldn't reasonably give them. The story arranged to flatter their preconceptions. He rubbed his eyes. The gesture was not intimate, it was human. I asked if he had eaten. He hadn't. I handed him the extra apple I'd packed and forgot about. He accepted it like an apology from the world. He took a bite with something like relief, and the sound was absurdly beautiful. We talked through the matrix of sign-offs for high-risk vendors. We moved faster now. The plan was clean, solid without being punitive. The longer we worked, the more the office folded into quiet. The hum of the elevator became the only companionable noise. The city beyond us stretched like a cat after rain. He set down his pen and looked at me the way someone looks at a horizon they can't name, unsure whether it is coastline or mirage. He said my name again, carefully, like someone reading a line from a poem they were afraid of loving. He told me I had become the person he counted on to make the truth walk, not just stand. He said that in a career built on choosing restraint over ruin, he had learned to cherish the rare colleagues who could hold fire without burning the building down. He said he had thought of the flowers as a note he didn't know how to write. I heard myself breathe. My chest ached with the pleasure and the terror of being known. I told him the card had startled me because it felt exactly right and exactly impossible, like hearing your native language whispered in a foreign country. I told him I did not want to be the story people told to entertain themselves, the woman they used to confer color on an otherwise gray narrative. I told him that having left a marriage without flames, I had promised myself never to enter a love that required hiding to survive. I said all of that without anger. My words came smooth. My pulse did not. He folded forward, elbows on thighs, hands clasped like someone about to surrender or pray. He said he did not know if it was love. He knew only that a measure had changed in the room each time I breathed, and he had remembered, for the first time in years, what it meant to have hope that was not professional. He said he did not want to ruin my reputation or his, nor did he want to treat our feelings like a faulty invoice to be recoded. He suggested time as the only honest partner. Finish the audit, close the loop with the board, set clear boundaries, and then, if the world still felt the same, ask the question we were both protecting. We sat in quiet after that, not a single word left to make better what was already good. The office had gone nearly dark, motion sensors waiting for us to forget our bodies long enough to turn out the lights entirely. He stood. I stood. We did not touch. He walked me to the elevator and stayed at the threshold. The elevator doors closed on his face, arranged in that careful calm he wore like armor. I rode down feeling like a violin that had been tuned by a master who chose not to play. The weeks that followed demanded something simpler than romance. Repair. We replaced a policy notch that had become a loophole. We trained managers until the training itself became its own rumor, this time a good one. The journalist wrote a follow-up story with less heat and more begrudging accuracy. The board voted to implement our changes without the graceless fanfare they had preferred at first. My lilies leaned and then bowed, aging elegantly on my windowsill. I pressed the card between the pages of a notebook and felt it whenever I closed it, a small heartbeat of paper. Colleagues remembered how to look me in the eye. The procurement manager accepted a lateral move with a pay cut, and to his credit, a vow to do it right. I found myself sleeping. Not well at first, but honest sleep, the kind that owes nothing and arrives anyway. My father called to tell me he was trying a calendar app, and I congratulated him as if he'd summited something. He laughed and said he still kept a pencil in his pocket for when the phone died or he did. We did not avoid each other, he and I. Avoiding would have had a narrative all its own, and we were not interested in feeding the building's favorite hobby. We maintained distance not of yards but of choices. If the elevator arrived with him in it, I waited for the next. If I was in the kitchen and he entered, one of us left just before the conversation's natural end, like dancers who knew the music but refused the obvious step. It was not performative. It was caretaking. After the audit closed, there was a Friday that felt like the first day of school in reverse. Everyone lighter, the public face of stress removed. The storms had become late summer showers that cooled without soaking. A colleague booked the conference room for a celebration, all paper cups and sheet cake. The way offices pretend to be families for an hour before returning to being villages. Someone played jazz too quietly from a phone, and the glass walls held the music the way they had held our tension. He stood across the room while people complimented him as if he had moved a mountain with his hands. He redirected every praise he could. When our eyes met, it felt like the season changed and no one else noticed. After people drifted back to their inboxes, he approached with the pace of a man returning a library book. He asked if I could walk a few blocks. The air felt like forgiveness. I said yes, not because of him but because of the afternoon itself, which had the exact hue of a chance worth taking. We walked without touching. We did the thing people in their 40s do when they have learned to carry their own weather. We talked about everything except the one thing. He pointed out a building he loved for its stubborn refusal to glossy itself. I pointed to a tree planted between potholes that had nevertheless decided to be beautiful. He told me his daughter had defended her proposal. I told him my mother had stopped asking if I would remarry and started talking about tomatoes instead. We turned at the corner where a coffee shop vented its espresso steam into the alley like breath. At the corner of Choice and Chance, we stopped. He told me he had submitted his name to chair a cross-border initiative that would relocate him for 6 months, perhaps more. He said it without theatrics. He said the board wanted him. He wanted the work. He said he would decline if I asked. The sentence sat between us like a plate of warm bread we could both smell, but neither would break. I shook my head. I told him I would never ask anyone to stop being the person I admired to make it easier for me to continue admiring. I told him I was not afraid of time. I was afraid of the stories people tell themselves to avoid it. If we were to be anything, it would not be because the universe cut us a slice of convenience. It would be because we chose to carry something delicate across a crowded room without dropping it. He exhaled, a soft surrender. He said then that he had meant the flowers, that he meant them still. He said the card had been both braver and more cowardly than he'd intended. He said if, after his return, after another season or two, we found that our restraint had only made us truer, he would ask me to dinner that was not on a desk. He said he would cook on a Sunday and let time be slow on purpose. He promised nothing else. Promises beyond that would have sounded like control, and we had both been controlled enough by life to resent it in even its prettiest forms. He left in October, the sky crisp, the morning suddenly unashamed to be cold. The office adjusted to his absence the way bodies adjust to a missing ring. There and not there, memory and skin. I ran the new process training without him and found that my voice carried fine. I sent him a photo of the first snow with no words. He returned a photo of a river that looked like brushed steel. We did not crowd the space between us with constant pings. We allowed hunger to be an honest interpreter. When loneliness visited, it did not dress like despair. It wore his navy tie and my navy dress, and it smelled faintly of lilies. I opened the notebook with the card pressed inside and let my thumb find the edge. For what we can't admit, it said, and I would whisper back, not yet. In January, while the city's breath crystallized on my scarf, the rumor mill did its work on another floor, leaving ours blessedly underwatered. The procurement manager transferred departments and months later, shook my hand with awkward sincerity in the lobby. The journalist tried another piece on another company. HR rebranded a training module, and everyone yawned in unison. Life has a habit of resuming. He returned in March, when the bridges thawed, and the evening held its light longer like a lover convinced of its own charm. I knew he was back before he told me, "The way you know a song has begun just outside your window." He appeared at my door and asked if I had a minute to review a draft. He looked older by a fine degree, improved the way leather improves, softened without losing structure. I had to inhabit my body with deliberate attention to prevent it from telling the room what it wanted. He thanked me for not letting the process degrade in his absence. I thanked him for returning without assuming an old shape. He asked if I was free on Sunday. He said he could cook. He said we could have dinner without policy or pretense. He said, simply my name. Then he waited like a man in a small boat who had learned to trust the river. I agreed because saying no felt like the dramatic move, and I had grown weary of drama. I agreed because saying yes felt like a small, brave task I had slowly trained for by making honest choices in less romantic rooms. He sent me an address where the street trees bent in the wind like a uniformed honor guard. He told me there would be a red pot on the stove. He warned me his music collection was mostly jazz and might try to seduce the room. I promised to behave like someone who had learned what patience tasted like and was willing to savor it a little longer. Sunday arrived quiet. The city had washed itself in rain for good luck. I wore a dress the color of a good night's sleep. He opened the door and stood aside as if ushering in an event. The room smelled like garlic softened in oil, like tomatoes that had decided to be generous, like the kind of evening I had once believed belonged only to people more beautiful or braver than me. He gestured to the table without touching me. We moved through the motions of ordinary people, making an ordinary meal extraordinary by refusing to rush. We spoke in the way people do when the next sentence might cause the earth to tilt. He told me the river city had impressed him by ignoring his hurry. I told him I had learned that the office did not need me to bleed to thrive. It needed me to show up clean. He said restraint had been a wall once. He had learned to turn it into a railing. I said I had stopped trying to be untouchable. I said I only wanted to be trustworthy. After dishes and the second glass of wine he should not have poured, and I should not have accepted, the room grew hushed. He reached for my hand the way someone reaches for a light switch in a familiar room. His fingers were warm, not insistent. My heart did not race as much as it recognized its own prepared speech. He leaned closer as if to speak. I felt his breath at my temple. He did not narrate a dream. He said only that I could leave whenever I wanted, and he would carry no resentment. The permission was a door. I decided to stay. When I kissed him, it was not fireworks. It was something better. That subtle shift of a building settling at night, the confidence that comes from knowing your own foundations. The room did not need us to perform. It simply offered itself as witness. The night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. In the mornings after, we did not stop being careful. We moved through the office like people who carry a fragile object wrapped in plain brown paper. We chose seats with intention and parted at the elevator with a touch that wouldn't stir envy or gossip. The rumors eventually forgot us because we weren't entertaining enough to feed them. The board preferred our competence to our mystery. The audit files lived in their quiet drawers, content to be what they had always been. The record of trying to do things right in a world that prefers shortcuts. Months later, when summer returned and the office emptied earlier on Fridays because even the ambitious have limits, I stood in my office and watched the light dim in squares across the carpet. The building's jazz station crooned something brushed and patient. He appeared in my doorway carrying nothing but calm. We would meet friends for dinner, people who knew us individually and would soon know us together. It felt both impossible and natural. He asked if the flowers had been too much that first week. I told him they had been exactly enough. He asked if the card had read like evasion. I said it had read like a future that hadn't learned its own language yet. I said it had made me feel held without being claimed. He stepped forward and did the smallest thing. He touched the small of my back with his palm, an anchor without insistence, a quiet hello to the body I had spent years disciplining. For a moment, we simply stood, the door open, the glass walls uninterested. Outside, rain started again in the amenable way summer rain does. All acceptance and glitter. The office lights dimmed one by one. The city's reflections loosened. We left together, not hurried, not announced, a pair of shadows learning to walk in tandem. If anyone noticed, they didn't tell the story. If anyone guessed, they kept the guess folded. The truth had become something less fragile than it once was. It could be carried lightly now. And when the next audit came, and people walked in with their tidy dread and their clipboards sharpened to points, we met them with the steadiness we had practiced. He asked better questions. I let silence do more work. The auditors, who were lovely people with both mothers and favorite songs, asked for coffee and smiled. We gave them what they needed. We kept what was ours. On my desk that week, there were no lilies. There was a small ceramic bowl we'd found in a weekend market, faintly blue, imperfect at the lip. I used it for paper clips. When I lifted it, I could smell the faint ghost of his soap from the morning he'd washed it, and the faint promise that the ordinary made sacred is the only kind of magic I trust. We wouldn't always be us in the shape we held then. Time would do as it liked. But we had learned to keep certain things intact. The elegance of a well-placed fact, the holiness of a pause, the bravery in a card that says precisely enough and no more. The rain returned and left and returned again. The skyline remembered to breathe. And when I think of that first bouquet, the ink on that card, the door I locked not to hide but to honor, I think of the gift he gave me without knowing. The permission to admit that what we couldn't admit had been waiting, patient as jazz, for us to turn down the noise and listen.